In the somber month of October in 2008, a shocking incident shattered the peace of a Pennsylvania church. A man was discovered with a fatal gunshot wound to the head, a scene so unsettling it rattled even the most seasoned detectives. The victim was identified as Joseph Musante, found lifeless at the pastor's desk. Initially, the scene suggested a tragic act of self-harm. Joseph left behind a wife, Cindy, his partner for 18 years, along with a daughter and a son, all now grappling with unimaginable grief and the haunting question of what led to this devastating moment. Rose Scobb, sister of the deceased Joe Scobb, rushed to the small town of Readers, Pennsylvania, upon hearing of her brother's tragic passing. She found it impossible to accept the idea that her brother had willingly ended his life. Only a handful of close family members attended Joe's funeral. Following the farewell ceremony, Rose visited the home where her brother had lived with his family for the last few years. She was taken aback to find the house completely empty. Surprisingly, none of Cindy Musante's friends and colleagues were there to support her. Nobody came to comfort her, offer sympathy, or express condolences. Rose inquired about Cindy's life with Joa, and the widow began her tale. At one point, she mentioned their family pastor, Arthur Burton Schirmer. Rose noticed Cindy's eyes light up with joy as she spoke of the revered man. Cindy worked as a secretary at the church. There was no doubt the woman harbored feelings of love for the pastor. Everyone around them knew it, and disapproval lingered in the air. Cindy confided in Rose, sharing the tragic news that Arthur had lost his beloved wife Betty, a mere 3 months prior. Betty's life was cut short in a devastating car accident. A deer had darted onto the road, causing her to lose control and crash into a guardrail. The impact resulted in injuries that proved fatal. As their conversation continued, Rose learned a startling detail. Betty was not Arthur's first wife. His first wife, Joelle, had also met an untimely end, passing away under mysterious circumstances after a fall down the stairs. Arthur Schirmer's biography cast a chilling shadow over Rose, especially the unsettling circumstances surrounding his wives' deaths. Could such things truly happen? She wondered with a shudder. Imagine then the turmoil endured by Samantha Musante, the eldest daughter of Joe and Cindy. At 16, she stumbled upon a clandestine affair that shattered her world. A stray text message, a confession of love from Arthur to Cindy, penned by none other than the town's esteemed pastor. Samantha was terrified. She knew her father, Joe Musante, a carpenter by trade, would be consumed by a rage unlike any she had ever witnessed. Joe, a man who had battled the insidious grip of alcoholism his entire adult life, sought solace and redemption at the local church. It was he who guided his family to Pastor Schirmer, hoping to find guidance and support. Joe immersed himself in church repairs, skillfully crafting wooden furniture, tables, chairs, pews, and shelves. He poured his heart and soul into these projects, even as his own home fell into disrepair, a stark reflection of the internal turmoil he couldn't quite escape. Then, a secret was unearthed. After discovering her mother's affair, Joe's daughter, Samantha, in a desperate act, penned an anonymous email to Pastor Schirmer. In it, she pleaded with him to end the illicit relationship with the married woman, hoping to salvage what was left of her family's fractured existence. Weeks trickled by before Arthur and Cindy unmasked the sender of that poison pen letter, none other than their own daughter, Samantha. Confronting her in private, they gently chided her for the accusation, vehemently denying any romantic entanglement. Samantha, though, was forced to feign belief in her mother's words. Meanwhile, suspicion began to gnaw at Joe. A gnawing feeling emerged, suggesting his wife was not faithful to him. It was then, in a moment of filial desperation, that Samantha confided in her father, confessing her deepest fears. Her mother was having an affair with the pastor. Joe was heartbroken. He had confronted Cindy, his wife, about her relationship with Arthur. Cindy vowed to end all communication with Arthur, but just days later, Joe discovered that she had secretly been calling him. The day before his death, on October 28, 2008, Cindy took their children to her sister's house and instructed everyone not to answer any calls from Joe. He called his daughter several times, and later that night, he left her a desperate voicemail. "Honey," he pleaded, "if you love me even a little bit, please call me back." Samantha didn't hear the message until the next morning. Her father was gone. Pennsylvania State Police launched an immediate investigation, but all signs pointed to a self-inflicted tragedy. Detective Jim Wagner took on the case. He meticulously reviewed the evidence, poring over every detail. The initial assessment of the officers at the scene appeared accurate. There was no blood to be found. However, an examination of Joe's shoes revealed shards of glass embedded in the soles. He had broken through the stained glass door of the church himself. He settled at the wooden pastor's table, recently built with his own 2 hands. Joe produced a pistol and fired a single shot into his head. Arthur Schirmer and Cindy Usanti both possessed airtight alibis. The pastor's residence was an hour's drive from the church itself. Cindy had spent the night at her sister's house. In the immediate aftermath of Joe's death, Arthur Schirmer was ousted from the church, prompting Detective Jim Wagner to delve into the priest's past. He was especially intrigued by the circumstances surrounding the death of his second wife, Betty, who had passed away only 3 months prior. The police ruled Betty's death a tragic roadside accident. No autopsy was performed, and the woman's body was cremated a mere 24 hours after the incident. The case was promptly closed. It all began in the early hours of July the 15th, 2008. Arthur recounted that his wife, Betty, had been struck with excruciating pain in her jaw. He decided they needed to rush to the hospital. Arthur slid behind the wheel, the leather cool beneath his fingertips. Betty settled into the passenger seat beside him, a nervous flutter in her chest mirroring his own. The car lurched forward, tires humming against the asphalt as they sped toward the hospital. 85 kilometers per hour. The speedometer needle trembled as Arthur pushed the limits. He needed to get there, and fast. Suddenly, a deer bolted onto the road, its eyes wide with panic. Reacting instantly, Arthur yanked the steering wheel hard to the right. The car skidded, a screech of tires against asphalt ending in a brutal collision with the guardrail. After what felt like an eternity, another vehicle finally pulled over. A man named Stan Dickerson emerged, driven by a desire to help. He cautiously approached the wrecked car, peering inside. "Are you all right?" Stan called out, his voice laced with concern. A man, who introduced himself as Arthur, responded with a chilling indifference. "I'm fine," Arthur said, his voice flat. "But my wife, she's in much worse shape." The scene was gruesome. Inside the wrecked car, blood was everywhere, painting a horrifying picture. A woman lay slumped in the passenger seat, completely unresponsive. A bystander, a man named Stan, immediately dialed emergency services, his voice trembling as he reported the accident. Within minutes, an ambulance screamed to a halt nearby. Paramedics rushed the injured woman, later identified as Betty, to the nearest hospital. Soon after, Betty's sisters arrived, their faces etched with worry and fear. But the news they received was devastating. The doctors somberly informed them that Betty's injuries were far too severe, and that she might not make it. The machines were switched off for Betty 24 hours later. She passed away. Julie and Emmy, Arthur's daughters from his first marriage to Jewel, were heartbroken by the tragic news. They cared deeply for their stepmother. The daughters couldn't imagine that their father might have been keeping secrets. Arthur and Betty had been married for 7 years. They met 2 years after Jewel's death. Arthur described Betty as more than just his second wife. She was his confidant, a constant source of support. In the sterile hospital room, moments after Betty's passing, the coroner pressed Arthur for a detailed account of the accident. Arthur reiterated his story. A deer had darted onto the road. Startled, he'd lost control of the vehicle, careening into the guardrail. A deafening screech filled the air. The car spun, a chaotic dance of metal and glass before overturning. Betty was thrown from the wreckage. Arthur insisted that his wife wasn't wearing a seatbelt, which he believed was the reason for the severity of her injuries. The case was swiftly closed, deemed a tragic accident. To his daughters, Arthur recounted a different version of events. He claimed that Betty had initially been wearing her seatbelt. However, during the drive, she complained that it was pressing uncomfortably and restricting her breathing. She unbuckled it, and almost immediately after, a deer appeared on the road. Yet, to Betty's sisters, Arthur painted a different picture entirely. He confided in them that his wife had made a habit of not wearing her seatbelt whenever she got into the car. Arthur insisted it was all just a game for her, a morbid fascination with how long she could push it before the car horn blared. Madness. Utter madness. He knew it didn't sound like Betty, not the Betty they all knew, but he swore it was true. Betty was cremated a mere 24 hours after she passed. Grief hung heavy in the air. Their close circle of female friends was too stricken with sorrow to question anything. Suspicion was the furthest thing from their minds. 4 months had drifted by when Detective Jim Wagner stumbled upon an oddity within the wreckage of the car crash. He pored over the case files, his gaze lingering on the crime scene photographs. A puzzling detail emerged: the telltale skid marks, those dark streaks left by tires desperately fighting for purchase, were conspicuously absent. There was no evidence of braking, no desperate attempt to halt the vehicle's forward surge. The car, aside from its crumpled front end, appeared remarkably intact. Even the airbags had remained stubbornly dormant. It became clear that the impact had occurred at a relatively low speed, and the vehicle itself was sound. Arthur, in theory, could have simply reversed and rushed his wife to the nearest hospital. Betty's head injury was alarmingly severe, seemingly disproportionate to the nature of the car accident. Detective Wagner's attention was further piqued by peculiar blood stains on the passenger seat. The speed at which the blood had soaked into the upholstery was unsettling. Wagner reasoned that in a vehicle violently tossed around, blood spatter would be widespread, yet the driver's seat remained untouched. The blood's concentrated absorption into the passenger seat suggested a grim possibility. A wounded Betty had been placed in the car before the crash even occurred. Driven by this suspicion, the detective resolved to delve deeper into the circumstances surrounding Schirmer's first wife's death. On the 23rd of April, 1999, tragedy struck. Jewel, while vacuuming the staircase in her home, lost her footing. She tumbled down the steps, striking her head with brutal force. Arthur, out for a run at the time, returned home to a horrifying scene. He found his wife lying at the foot of the stairs, a pool of blood spreading around her. Jewel was unconscious. Arthur frantically dialed for an ambulance, his heart pounding in his chest. She was rushed to the hospital, but after only a few hours, Jewel passed away without ever regaining consciousness. The initial medical assessment pointed towards a heart attack as the cause of Jewel's demise. However, the medical examiner's autopsy report painted a different picture. Jewel's heart was found to be in perfect health, dismissing the heart attack theory entirely. While she exhibited multiple skull fractures, surprisingly, there were no other significant injuries to her body. In fact, the examination revealed a distinct lack of substantial trauma below her neck. This absence of widespread injuries raised serious doubts about the fall from stairs scenario. A fall severe enough to cause skull fractures would typically result in a variety of other injuries. Due to these inconsistencies, the medical examiner classified the cause of death as undetermined. This ambiguity opened up the unsettling possibility that Jewel's death may have been the result of foul play. The question lingered. Had she been murdered? A medical examiner urged the police to launch an immediate investigation, but for reasons unknown, it never materialized. Arthur, the husband, along with his 2 daughters, genuinely believed Jewel's death was the result of a tragic fall down the stairs. In 1999, the case was closed. Then, in December of 2008, Detective Wagner and his team obtained a warrant to search the home of Arthur and Betty. The investigators uncovered crucial evidence. In the garage, the detective noticed aged bloodstains on the concrete floor. Using a chemical called luminol, they discovered a trail of blood leading from the back door of the house to the garage, and more precisely, to the front passenger seat of a car parked there. Later analysis revealed it was Betty's blood. This grim discovery suggested that even before Betty entered the car, she was already grievously wounded and bleeding profusely. As Jim Wagner and his team meticulously searched the pastor's residence, the Pennsylvania State Police were deep in questioning Reverend Schirmer. Arthur initially staunchly denied that Betty had ever bled in their garage. Then, in a sudden shift, he recalled an incident where Betty had injured herself shortly before her death. Arthur recounted that he and his wife were carrying firewood from the garage, stacking it into a woodpile in the backyard. Below, nestled within the pile of logs, lay newspapers. The detective's eyes were drawn to the date, September of 2008. This single detail suggested that both the newspapers and the firewood had been placed in the woodpile after Betty's death. A year slipped by. Arthur Schirmer continued his affair with the widow, Cinda Musa. Initially, he spent every weekend at her house, but soon he moved in with her permanently. By that time, Samantha Musanta had turned 18 and moved out of her mother's house. Not long after, Samantha learned that Arthur was under investigation for suspected murder. In the summer of 2010, Arthur proposed to Cindy, presenting her with a ring. Overjoyed, she accepted his proposal. This news deeply troubled Samantha. The young woman feared her mother might suffer the same fate as Arthur's previous wives. Samantha tried to warn her mother, explaining the potential danger, but Cindy seemed completely under Arthur's spell. infatuated with the priest. Realizing the urgency of the situation, the police decided swift action was necessary. In September of 2010, just weeks after Arthur proposed to Cindy, he was arrested and charged with the murder of his second wife, Betty. Betty had been cremated, precluding an autopsy. Investigators turned to Dr. Wayne Ross, who had performed Jules' autopsy back in 1999, asking him to review Betty's medical records from her accident. Dr. Ross employed CT scans of Betty to create a three-dimensional visualization of her injuries. He was struck by the uncanny resemblance between Betty's injuries and those of Jules. Dr. Ross stated, "Let's use some common sense here. What are the odds that two women marry the same man, sustain lacerations and injuries to the right side of their heads, and both die from head trauma under bizarre circumstances?" Months after Schirmer's arrest, Dr. Ross accompanied investigators to the Pasternak residence, the site of Jules' fatal injuries. Their goal was to scrutinize Arthur's account of Jules tripping over a vacuum cleaner and tumbling down the stairs. In a series of experiments, they propelled mannequins down the staircase multiple times, meticulously analyzing how a woman might sustain a lethal impact. Dr. Ross ultimately concluded that Jules' injuries were inconsistent with a fall down the stairs. He believed that she had been struck on the head with a pipe, or a similar blunt object. Arthur's defense attorney, Brendan Wrench, maintained that the two wives' deaths were tragic accidents. He dismissed the mannequin and ladder recreation as folly. The defense attorney argued that a proper experiment would require a living subject, yet no one would volunteer for such a dangerous test. Regardless, after the tests concluded, Jules' death was officially ruled a homicide. Arthur and Jules' daughters refused to believe their father capable of murdering their mother. Jules had been struck on the head approximately 14 times. In September of 2012, Arthur Schirmer, already in custody for the death of Betty, was charged with Jules' murder. Arthur was initially tried for the murder of his second wife, Betty, with Pastor's attorney doing everything possible to defend him, claiming that Arthur had no motive to kill his wife. Arthur Schirmer, unyielding and dry-eyed, stood before the court, vehemently denying his guilt. With his hand placed firmly on the Bible, he swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. It was January the 8th, 2013, nearly 4 years after Betty's tragic passing, that Schirmer faced his accusers. The prosecuting attorney painted a damning portrait of the former pastor, branding him a sinister monster whose life was interwoven with deceit. The prosecution's case rested on a chilling array of evidence: Betty's blood, discovered in the garage, and the gruesome saturation of bloodstains on the front passenger seat. Further compounding the suspicion, a neat stack of coins lay undisturbed on the dashboard of Schirmer's vehicle, defying the laws of physics in the aftermath of the supposed accident. The question that lingered in the air, unanswered and unsettling, was the mystery of the deer. Was it truly there on the road that fateful night? Or was it a phantom, a fabrication to mask a darker truth? For there was no evidence of impact with an animal. Arthur's actions following his wife's death raised eyebrows and fueled suspicion. The cremation itself was unusual, but the urn he selected, adorned with a depiction of a stag, struck many as a cruel and tasteless jest. The atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with tension when a woman took the stand, revealing a years-long affair with Arthur. She recounted how they had met at church during a particularly vulnerable period in her life. Arthur, she claimed, had preyed upon her emotional state, engaging in infrequent rendezvous at a local hotel, approximately thrice annually, over several years. Their relationship, she emphasized, was purely physical, devoid of any emotional connection. The mistress was aware of Pasteur's marital status. During the trial, Arthur initially denied having an affair. However, he eventually confessed that intimacy between him and his wife Betty had ceased several years prior. He explained that Betty's disinterest in intimacy was due to menopause. Arthur claimed that he resorted to watching adult films and, occasionally, seeking out other women to satisfy his needs. After an hour and a half of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. 64-year-old Arthur Schirmer was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of his second wife, Betty. Arthur Schirmer received a life sentence without parole. Cindy Sante was not involved in Betty's murder. However, she was criticized for bringing Arthur into her home so soon after her husband Joseph's death, which was traumatic for her children, who had just lost their father. Betty's sisters felt relief when Arthur was punished, but they knew that Betty, like the deceased Joseph Musante, could never be brought back. Were it not for Joe's sister, Rose Scobb, Arthur Schirmer might never have been suspected, as it was confirmed that Joe fired the shot that drew attention to the pastor in the first place. Arthur was supported by his daughters and Cindy's fiancée, Ariana, who defended her beloved in court. Although they never married, Cindy considers herself Schirmer's wife. Samantha's voice carried a quiet weight as she spoke of the chasm that had grown between her and her mother. While the woman readily embraced Samantha's sisters, showering them with affection and playing a vital role in their children's lives, a stark contrast painted her relationship with Samantha. "What kind of relationship do I have with my mother?" Samantha echoed, her words hanging in the air. "None. We have no relationship at all. She's simply not the same person anymore. She wasn't the mother who raised me. My deepest wish is for Cindy to truly see Arthur, to witness his authentic self, the man he truly is." The case surrounding the death of Arthur's first wife, Jo Schirmer, remains unresolved, an open wound in the past. The investigation is still ongoing, casting a long shadow. Yet, Cindy Musante stands firmly by Arthur's side, expressing unwavering certainty that the pastor is completely innocent. The idea of traveling to a new country can be both exhilarating and daunting. The sheer thought of venturing into the unknown is pretty scary, but in reality, it is a mind-blowing experience.